This is a video regarding Richard Gardner and PAS theory by a mom. Richard Gardner was born in 1931 in the Bronx, New York. He studied medicine and psychiatry at various prestigious New York universities. He served a stint as a U.S. Army psychiatrist in Germany. In 1963, he was appointed to the Division of Child Psychiatry at Columbia University. He would have been 32 years old. Approximately 1978, Richard Gardner lost his hospital admitting privileges. He would have been about 47 years old. In 1983, he first claimed to have become a clinical professor of psychiatry. It's probable that this is when he actually began the unpaid volunteer position. Gardner's PAS theory. Parental alienation syndrome, otherwise known as PAS, is the creation of one man, Richard Gardner, a psychiatrist who discovered the so-called syndrome in approximately 1985. Gardner's PAS theory was developed solely through personal observations of his patients in private practice. Gardner introduced the theory to explain what he considered to be an epidemic of false accusations of child sexual abuse. Gardner's theory rests on the premise that the vast majority of abuse allegations in custody cases are false and the result of one parent's alienation of the child from the other parent. Specifically, Gardner theorizes that the child not only is systematically brainwashed by the alienating parent, who is usually the mother, but that the child is also subconsciously programmed by that parent to hate the other parent, who is usually the father. According to Gardner, this programming results in false accusations by the child of abuse. PAS is founded upon circular logic, which also makes it inherently unreliable as a scientific diagnostic tool. PAS is offered to prove that abuse did not occur, yet it assumes the truth of what it seeks to prove, that the child's allegations of abuse are false. Gardner contends that the vast majority of abuse allegations that arise in child custody disputes are false, and one of his strongest criteria for proving the falsity of an allegation is the fact that it was first raised in a child custody dispute. The child's allegations of abuse are seen as the product of a mental disorder suffered by the child as a result of the supposed alienation, and as the product of a warped perspective, the allegations are discounted and even completely ignored by counsel, courts, and others who subscribe to Gardner's description of parental alienation syndrome. It is frankly irresponsible to describe such conduct in terms of a psychological syndrome that supposedly produces a mental defect in a child and automatically renders the child's revelations of abuse incredible. Dr. Kaplan today points out the discredited diagnosis of PAS, or an allegation of parental alienation, quite apart from its scientific invalidity, inappropriately asked the court to assume that the child's behaviors and attitudes towards the parent who claims to be alienated have no grounding in reality. It also diverts attention away from the behaviors of the abusive parent, who may have directly influenced the child's responses. The task for the court is to distinguish between situations which the child is critical of one parent because they have been inappropriately manipulated by the other, and in situations in which the child has his or her own legitimate grounds for criticism or fear of a parent, which will likely be the case when that parent has perpetrated domestic violence. Those grounds do not become less legitimate because the abused parent shares them and seeks to advocate for the child by voicing his or her concerns. PAS is merely a theory. It is not accepted as a psychological syndrome or a diagnosis. It has not been recognized by the American Psychiatric Association or any other respected medical or professional association. After Gardner developed his parental alienation syndrome in the 1980s, he and Columbia slowly distanced themselves from each other, and he spent most of his time in private practice in New Jersey. PAS theory made Richard Gardner a very rich man. Gardner testified mostly for men, charging $500 an hour, routinely recommending custody to abusers, deprogramming children, and threat therapy for mothers. Gardner testified in over 400 cases. Gardner was against society's overly moralistic and punitive reaction to pedophiles. Gardner published over 250 books and articles. According to the American Prosecutors Research Institute in Virginia, Gardner's research, including PAS, has not been peer-reviewed or officially recognized by the AMA or the APA. Gardner has been able to get around a peer review process by publishing his own works. Creative Therapeutics, which published Parental Alienation Syndrome, as Gardner's own publishing company. In addition to the invalidity of PAS theory, Gardner's books were also highly controversial because they endorsed pedophilia. In 1986, Gardner self-published Child Custody and Litigation, wherein he wrote, "At the present time, the sexually abused child is generally considered to be the victim, though the child may initiate sexual encounters by seducing the adult." Approximately 1988, Richard Gardner had his last conversation with the Dean of Columbia University. Between 1988 and his death in 2003, he continued to fraudulently represent that he had an association with the university. In October of 1990, in his self-published Self-Abuse Hysteria, Salem Witch Trials Revisited, Gardner endorsed reduced consequences for pedophilia, saying, "What I am against is the excessively moralistic and punitive reaction that many members of our society have towards pedophiles, going far beyond what I consider to be the gravity of the crime." In the same publication, Gardner says, "Judges may have repressed pedophilic impulses over which there is suppression, repression, and guilt. Inquiry into the details of the case provides voyeuristic and vicarious gratifications." When I read this quote, I wonder, why do so many judges listen to this guy? Are judges not highly insulted by this? Had every judge that has ever been confronted with Gardner's testimony or PAS theory also been aware of Gardner's 1990 published generalized assumption about judges, far fewer judges would have been led so far off course from the best interest of the child. In Gardner's 1992 self-published book, True and False Accusations of Child Sex Abuse, Gardner writes that pedophilia, adults having sexual relations with children, is a widespread and accepted practice among literally billions of people. Historically, pedophilia is more common during and following wars and in societies depraved enough to commit genocide. Gardner may have observed and tried to make sense of post-war pedophilia when he was posted in Germany prior to 1963. Gardner said, "All of us have some pedophilia within us." Gardner states, "It is of interest that of all the ancient peoples it may very well be that the Jews were the only ones who were punitive towards pedophiles." The Daubert decision was made in 1993. Tim Burton notes in his brief that because it has not been accepted or endorsed by any professional organization or association in the fields of psychology or psychiatry, Gardner's PAS theory is inadmissible under either the Frye test or the more recent standard established by the United States Supreme Court. Justice for Children puts it this way: PAS cannot pass the challenges for acceptance as scientific or expert in courts of law. These challenges are called Daubert challenges, named after the Supreme Court ruling on what constitutes scientific or expert testimony. Testimony that a party to a custody case suffers from the syndrome should therefore be ruled inadmissible both under the standard established in Daubert and the stricter Frye standard. In 1994, there was a major revision to the DSM, and the book came out called the DSM-4. PAS is not included in the 4th edition or any earlier version of that respected diagnostic manual. Child psychologists and child psychiatrists routinely rely on the DSM-4, which includes only those disorders that have been subjected to extensive research and peer review, to diagnose and treat recognized mental disorders. The introduction to the DSM-4 states that the utility and credibility of DSM-4 requires that it focus on its clinical research and educational purposes and be supported by an extensive empirical foundation. According to Violence in the Family, a 1996 report of the American Psychological Association Presidential Task Force on Violence in the Family, the task force found that the court decisions awarding an allegedly abusive father custody of his children may improperly rely on inaccurate and unsupported theories, such as the parental alienation syndrome. In 1997, Justice Chisholm of the Indiana Court of Appeals stated, "This gender-based generalization is ludicrous and an affront to all reasonable women and men. It is unacceptable." And likening PAS to pop psychology or cult theories like the Peter Pan syndrome or the Cinderella complex, Justice Chisholm went on to describe PAS as a disturbing, inflammatory, unscientific, and unsubstantiated theory which has no place in our courtroom. In 1999, the Supreme Court ruled that even expert testimony based on the soft sciences must meet the standards set in the Daubert case. This is the end of part 1. Please continue with part 2.